perhaps because of our weather, we are living in the desert. How do you define the desert?
It can certainly feel like the desert. It's felt like the desert a lot in the last few
This
weeks
summer,
here.
yeah.
But no, we are not. We live in a Mediterranean climate. My friend and colleague Mike Davis wrote a book several years ago called The Ecology of Fear, where he detailed the climatological and ideological particulars of our region. We're west of the West, as Theodore Roosevelt once said of Los Angeles and the California coast, the left coast. But we are tethered to the desert West in an intricate way, and we are tethered to the West in cultural and political and economic ways. In many ways, Los Angeles is the culmination of the process of course, Manifest Destiny, the bloody scrim of it ended on the coast. And the speculation and land grabs that occurred throughout that process culminate here in Los Angeles. Now what's happening, though, is that there's a tide moving the other way, kind of like a reverse Manifest Destiny, if you will. The gentrification wars of the early 2000s pushed people out of the coastal areas, the Bay Area and Los Angeles, Southern California area, back into the West. And so we're seeing a wave going in that direction, which is rebrowning, if you will, several parts of the Southwest. Most people think of Arizona today as Jan Brewer territory, toughest American Sheriff Joe territory, SB 1070 territory. But there's been talk about even Arizona turning the red to the blue column in electoral politics because of demographic change. Latinos are a huge part of that population, SB 1070 notwithstanding. And this is true throughout the Desert West. Without Nevada, New Mexico, having turned from the red to the blue column, Barack Obama would not be in the White House today. And shortly, I hereby predict the downfall of Jan Brewer and SB 1070 because demographics can't sustain that kind of politics.
Now, you live in LA currently, but you've lived in a number of the cities that you, of course, write about in your book, because this is not just a standard history, it's a very personal history. But it's even more than that. I mean, it's journalistic. How do you describe your book? I was trying to put my finger on it, and I couldn't.
Post. It's a little bit, yes, you're right. It is a little bit of everything. It started out in a very personal vein. I arrived in the desert. Many of your listeners here in Southern California will be familiar with the Joshua Tree area. Joshua Tree is 2 hours on the other side of the San Bernardino Mountains from here. That's where the desert really begins for us. And I arrived there about 12 years ago under very difficult personal circumstances. I was lucky enough to have a book contract with a New York publisher and thought I'd, really made it in that sense, in the writerly sense. But as many writers will tell their sad tales, I had spent the book advance. I didn't have a word written, and I was broke. And to add, on top of all that, had problems with drugs. And I went to the desert, as many people do, on a healing kind of pilgrimage. People have been doing that for a long time, whether it was the Egyptian desert of the 4th century, the Christian mystics, to the consumptives of the 19th century, to all kinds of New Age pilgrimages today. I was part of that lineage. I wasn't aware of it at that particular moment because my life was so dark. But that's how I arrived in the desert. And so originally, the book was just going to be an ode to that healing, beautiful, sublime landscape that many of us go to get away from the city. When I arrived in the desert, however, I quickly became aware that along with the sublimity of it, there was also a terribly contradicted human geography. I was going into a landscape of extreme poverty. I was going onto a landscape where drugs are produced and consumed in increasing quantities, where people are smuggled, a place where there's blood on the sand.
And so you sort of describe the romanticization that many of us have of the desert, but you came face to face with a lot of the reality. And one of the interesting realities were these population shifts, layer upon layer of various populations, Native American populations, Mexican populations that have been there from forever, and new immigrants. Your own background is a mixed immigrant heritage. shortage. How did all of these various, and then of course to add to that poverty and as you said, drug use, how do you see how do you explain this evolution over the past 10 years? Do you see what happened as a result of gentrification, the economy? I mean, at the time, in the past 10 years or so, 10 years ago or so, we were supposed to be in a boom, in an economic boom. But that wasn't true all over, of course.
No. I think what the Desert West and borderlands tell us, they tell us the story of the Great Recession writ large. They tell us that even at the peak of the boom, 2006, 2007, when you turned on the television and practically everything was about the lives of the rich and the famous and flipping this house and all those reality shows about real estate speculation and the inflated prices and, of course, the toxic loans that would ultimately make that house of cards collapse. Even at that moment, income inequality was growing. It was growing in the Desert West greater than any other place in the country. The real estate prices were inflated more than any other place in the country, and more toxic loans were being given out than any other place in the country. Add to that the fact that the Desert West had exploded in terms of population growth greater than any other region of the country, and so you had a mixture that was so volatile. And so that's why you see in the inland counties of Southern California, Riverside and San Bernardino, blocks of houses in the subdivisions where 9 out of 10 houses were foreclosed. And the devastating unemployment in Nevada, the extremes of the 0.1% of the 1% in northern New Mexico where I lived at the center of a triangle between Taos, Los Alamos, and Santa Fe, the 3 richest cities, not just in New Mexico, but among the 3 richest places in America. And I lived at the center of that triangle in the Española Valley, which is one of the poorest places in the country. And
actually, I want to describe, yes. I want to read your description of it in the book. Velarde is the name of this place. Yes. You said it's one of the poorest villages in one of the poorest counties in one of the poorest states, and the region's per capita rate of heroin addiction is higher than anywhere else in the country, rural or urban. Exactly. So why did you go there? And what did you find?
The reason was, again, drugs. I was following my wife, Angela Garcia, who also wrote a book called The Pastoral Clinic about our time in Velarde. She's a medical anthropologist and was finishing her dissertation research, which entailed studying heroin. In particular, her family's from New Mexico. I married into the Garcia clan of New Mexico. And she didn't want to literally study her own family's problem with drugs. My family has, on both sides of our family, we have issues with drugs and alcoholism, as so many American families do. So she didn't want to study her own family in Albuquerque. That would have been too devastating. So she chose a village a couple hundred miles up north in Velarde, which happened to, as you said from that excerpt, have the highest rate of heroin addiction of anywhere in the country, in the Española Valley. So I was following my wife, Angela, and somehow at the moment when she said, "Do you want to come with me?" We weren't married yet. "Do you want to come with me to northern New Mexico and live together and do this project with me?" I said, "Yeah, that'd be great. I love northern New Mexico. It's so beautiful up there, you know." And immediately all the images of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains and Taos Pueblo and George O'Keeffe and R.C. Gorman prints flooded into my mind. And the fact that we were going to this poor area devastated by drugs seemed to have receded in my mind. And that's one of the central arguments of the book. When we think of the Desert West landscape, many of the listeners today, of course, know about SB 1070 and Sheriff Joe and toxic real estate and all that stuff. But the imaginary of the West, the Old West, through so many generations of great artists, really, and the Western genre in film, those layers of aesthetic imagination tend to wallpaper over the devastating contradictions economically and socially that exist on that very same landscape.
My guest, Ruben Martinez, is going to be at the Ford Amphitheater this Friday, September 28th, and copies of his book will be available, Desert America. You're also going to be part of a night of performance, unearthing radical LA history. It's called the Ballad of Ricardo Flores Magon. And later in the program, I do want to ask you to tell our listeners briefly who Magon was. But that's happening this Friday at 8 p.m. at the Ford Amphitheater, right close here to KPFK, 2580 Cahuenga Boulevard East in LA. Now, in these places that you live, Velarde and other parts of the Southwest desert region, there is also art and there's also clashes between environmentalists and business interests. So that sort of spices things up, if you will.
Yes. And for many of our listeners here in the Pacifica Network, these contradictions are very difficult for progressives. I lived in an area in northern New Mexico, Velarde, that is got about 2 million acres of public land, mostly forest, the Santa Fe and Carson National Forests. The Hispanos, as they call themselves in that area, they use that term purposefully. The Hispanos of that area trace their lineage back practically 500 years. They arrived with the very early Spanish settlers. Those families have a direct lineage, and they have land grants. They can pick out the old, from the treasure chest of the family lore, that piece of paper that says King Carlos, gave them this land 15 generations ago. Most of those lands were stolen, of course, by the Santa Fe Ring and in the Old West performance of Manifest Destiny. But much of the land grants, a percentage of the land grants continue to exist, and many Hispano activists still say that they should have access to the old commons, ejido in Spanish, to do small-scale logging. This pits them against traditional environmentalists who, some of them would say zero cut, of course, and others say only very limited, very small level logging should occur. But the Hispanos have a claim to the land and claim to have a knowledge of the land that predates the arrival of environmentalists who live in chalets in Santa Fe. So there's class contradictions, there's an argument over ecology and what's right for that particular land, what's really sustainable. Grazing permits, for example, for livestock, that's still something that's fought over, and so you have several people laying claim to the same landscape. Native Americans hardly need show their credentials in terms of claiming their birthright to the land. The Hispanos and their interests and in terms of the way the land is used, and then the more recent arrivals that include many environmentalists and progressive activists who look at this landscape and are trying to do the right thing, but don't always coincide, of course, with the other indigenous populations.
In Chapter 3 of your book, In the Shadow of Black Mesa, or actually rather Chapter 4, Water in the Desert, you describe the encounter between the region's, Arizona's oldest populations, the Native Americans, and its newest residents, migrants coming over the border. Tell us about your experience there. You spent a lot of time there on the border, and you saw these interesting encounters, and they're not always what we think they are. No,
there's just so many places in the borderlands where ironies like this appear. So the Tohono O'odham Reservation, which is one of the least known, actually, I think, to most people. Most people, when you think of the reservations in the borderlands, you immediately think Hopi, you think Navajo. The Tohono O'odham, however, is actually one of the largest reservations in the United States. It's a huge, sprawling area that straddles over 70 miles of the U.S.-Mexico border, south and west of the Tucson area. It's in our old Western imagination, it's saguaro cacti, those big column of cacti that grow sometimes 50 feet high. So you can imagine those cacti silhouetted with the orange blazing sunset and a cowboy running off into it. But it's a Native American land that straddles that border. Indeed, does not recognize that border because the ancestral lands go deep into Mexico. Today, there is a scar upon the land mandated by the Secure Fence Act of 2006, and many of the ceremonial sites that many Tohono O'odham Nation members would access by just literally walking across the desert are no longer accessible to them for their feast days, for example. And the most terrible of the ironies is that area has received more migrant traffic, human migrant traffic, and drug traffic in the last 10, 15 years than any other place along the border, because it's the most isolated, the most dangerous, the most desolate, and waterless place along the border. So you have Native Americans receiving a flood of immigrants, many of whom, of course, are indigenous Americans as well. And I happen to accompany a Native American Tohono member named Mike Wilson, an activist who saw brothers and sisters coming across the border. That's the way he regarded them. The Tohono Nation itself has had a much more difficult political time and gone back and forth over how to receive the indigenous migrants, whether to put out water or not. Mike Wilson says they must receive water, we must help them. And so he's seeing Mayan, Quiche Indians coming from Guatemala, for example, and saying we must receive them.
Well, there's so much more to talk about in your book. Listeners can check out the book by getting copies this Friday, September 28th, at an event happening at the Ford Amphitheater, 2580 Cahuenga Boulevard at 8 p.m. The Ballad of Ricardo Flores Magón is a night of performance unearthing radical LA history. Not only are you going to be offering copies of your book, you're going to be part of this performance. You're hosting it along with Raquel Gutierrez. Who was Magón?
He is one of radical LA's best kept secrets. Ricardo Flores Magón was here just before and during the Mexican Revolution, here in Los Angeles, exiled from the dictatorship in Mexico that the revolution got rid of. He is the anarchist. He was the patron saint of Occupy, if I can use that term, the patron saint of Occupy LA. His slogan, Land and Liberty, Tierra y Libertad, which Emiliano Zapata took up during the revolution, floated over Solidarity Park for quite some time. It's an amazing radical political saga that takes place here in Los Angeles. The villains are the LA Times, the LAPD, the Pinkertons, and the occupiers of their day 100 years ago are Flores Magón, Emma Goldman, Job Harriman, a who's who of radical Los Angeles of that time. And with music and theater, we're going to bring that period to life at the Ford Amphitheater on Friday night.
And the event is sponsored by KPFK. Listeners can check out more about it at kpfk.org, where you can also find out how you can get tickets. You can also call 323-461-3673 or go to fordamphitheater.org. Ruben Martinez, I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Sonali.